thought you asked me to wait another 2 minutes, but we'll get started, I think.
Yes, we've been asked to give everybody till 11:05 to get into the room, but thank you for the applause anyway. So we'll start in just a couple of minutes. All right, good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to start off day 3 at Esxence, and we have a very special presentation this morning. I'm Mark Behnke. I'm the editor-in-chief of the blog colonoseur.com. I'm also a research chemist in my day job, and the reason I am saying that, because what we're here to talk about today and celebrate is the 30th edition of this book, Fragrances of the World 2014. It is the singular reference manual for perfumery. And as a scientist, to have this kind of a reference available to me is invaluable. But I know it's invaluable to every aspect of this industry. There is nobody that does not pick up this book and get themselves lost in the rich amount of data that Michael has collected over the last 30 years. And it is that collection of this observation of this industry over 30 years that gives Michael the most unique perspective of anybody at this fair that you'll meet today. Michael has observed this industry for 30 years. He has seen trends. He has seen the explosive growth that we all see, but Michael observes it as what I call the record keeper. For those of you that are Americans, there is a great Native American tradition of the Navajo storyteller. I think of Michael as the Navajo storyteller of perfume. He gathers all of the information. He has all of this thing. And as a result, at every point when I speak with Michael, I learn something new about perfume. But for those of you that don't have the opportunity to speak with Michael, this wonderful reference is where you can learn something new from perfume. And so at the point, and as a scientist, I always love to understand the very beginnings of things. And so to start today, the one thing that I asked Michael as his first question, and he knows this is coming, how did you understand there was a need for a volume, for a reference like this 30 years ago? We all know we need one now. So Michael, please.
The simple answer is I didn't. I once asked Guy Robert, the great perfumer who created Madame Rochas Calèche, my mentor. I said to him, what makes a great perfume? I never forget his answer. It was so sensible. He said, a great perfume is a good perfume that had the luck to be chosen by the right person in the right company at the right time. That's what happened to me. I didn't plan this. I didn't see the need. It just so happened I had to have one. I came up through marketing, the fast-moving consumer goods. We were fascinated by the power of perfume, fragrance, to change people's perception of the products, change the fragrance, and often people figured there was something better about the product. But I knew nothing about it. It was a jumble of smells until Firmenich took me in hand in the mid-70s and introduced me to the fragrance families. They had a guide called the Bouquet de la Parfumerie. Oh, it was complicated, but it classified fragrances into accords or groups. A chord is simply a mixture of 2 or 3 materials, and classified them by family. I always remember there was one accord. It was a green, woody, animalic floral aldehyde. Guess what that is? With Chanel 19. So you'll understand, I didn't know too much about this. Maybe 5% I understood. But it was so useful. I would take that guide into stores and I would smell and compare, and it taught me a great deal. Firmenich stopped that guide in 1978, and by that time I was working in Paris for Halston, when Halston was a great brand looking after the international markets. And I asked Firmenich if would they permit me to resurrect the Bouquet de la Perfumery, would they help me to condense it, update, and they did, and I put it out to my staff around the world, and it worked. Because, you know, people in stores tend to sell the perfumes they like and hold back from the ones they don't. And as a result, you know, when you go into most stores, what you're actually being given is the result of what I like. Now, what you like could be something totally different. So I put this little guide out, and it worked. Little puppies that were fast asleep on the shelf started to bark, and I became more and more intrigued. Well, fast forward, early 80s, Halston lost control of his license. He was a genius. I revered the man. Difficult as hell. He ignored me for the first, I think, 8 months that I worked for him. But what a genius. But he didn't have control of his license, and he lost it, and he retired, a very hurt and bruised man, and I left the company. And I'd become more and more fascinated by the problems that we were having in those days, in trying to help customers. I mean, remember, if you would, life was a little different. I pulled up these figures so that you could see. In 1983, when the year that I started my guidebook, that was 30 fragrances. 10 years later, 132. 10 years after that, 581. Last year we tracked 1,431. It was explosive. The key fragrance for me was Charlie. I know it's El Cheapo today, but Charlie was the fragrance that changed the whole world. Before Charlie, perfume was a gift. Men bought perfume and gave it to women, and women wore perfume really only when they went out or on special occasions. There was no usage during the day, mostly. It was Charlie that spoke to a new generation. Remember, if you would, going back. And you have to go back, because you can't separate fragrance from the people who use it. Fragrance is not a product. It's a sociological phenomena of its time, and always has to be related to the time in which it comes out. And back then, we were faced with the fact that women around the world were starting to move from home to the workplace. Cosmopolitan magazine christened them the cosmonauts. A whole new generation of women who had money, they were working. And Charlie tickled their imagination. Why wait for somebody to give it to you, was the idea. So they started buying it, they started wearing it. And it was Charlie that opened up the world of marketing in the 1970s. And then in 1977 came opium. Opium is the Jaws of the fragrance industry. I say Jaws because Jaws was the first movie that took marketing and opened up in 1,000 movie theaters across the States. Opium was our first blockbuster, 1977, and between Charlie and opium, the world shook. By the end of the 70s, women were spending more money on buying perfume for themselves than men were spending on giving it to them. And then the third fragrance that I must bring up is Giorgio, and you probably wonder why, but Giorgio was the fragrance that persuaded retailers around the world that perfume was not just a nice accessory, but a core product. When Giorgio came out in Bloomingdale's, it became part of history's legend there. It became part of the New York experience. You went to New York, you went up the Empire State Building, you went to see the Statue of Liberty, and you went into Bloomingdale's to see Giorgio at its peak, $183 million. It was a phenomenon. No store had ever really taken fragrance seriously before Giorgio. It was nice, they stocked it in a perfume department, but the stores regarded clothes as probably their core product. Giorgio changed that whole market at that kind of one. But we're still faced with the fact that even back then, we had no language of perfume. What you describe as heavy, somebody else describes as foul, and the third person says it's sublime. There is no common language that we use on perfume. We're fascinated by it, but we're frustrated by the problems we have in trying to find a perfume that we may like. Allure magazine famously quoted, "Trying to find the right fragrance is almost as hard as trying to find the right man." And it really is when you think of it. In many ways, we were back in the ages of bad wine. I remember when I was a kid taking a girl out for my first time to an expensive restaurant, and this maitre d' slithers up there with this vast wine list. I couldn't even pronounce most of the names. I hadn't got a clue what they were there. And I remember just looking at something and putting it like that, and there was probably a smirk on his face, and I felt totally intimidated. Somehow we still have that for many people in the fragrance business. One woman in a focus group just last week said she's had her first baby, been out of looking for perfume for about 19, 20 months. She said, I went in there, I felt intimidated. I didn't know half these fragrances. And you can understand that in a world where there were 1,400 odd fragrances last year. For me, though, the key to helping customers lay in the fragrance family. This was my Firmenich training background. In many ways, I use the analogy with wine. We have forgive me while I just come behind. We have white wines, we have red wines, we have fortified wines, and we have sparkling wines. And if you like white wines, people would say, would you prefer a Chardonnay or a Pinot Grigio or a Sauvignon Blanc? Each has got its own personality, its own character. We have the same logic when you think of it in perfume. We have florals, we have orientals, we have woody notes, and we have fresh notes. And if you like Oriental, I can give you a true Oriental. Think of Shalimar, think of Obsession, or Prada Candy. A softer Oriental, this is the family that the perfumers call semi-Orientals. Because I came from retail, I call it soft, because if I say to a customer it's a semi-Oriental, they think they're only getting part of what they paid for. It's true, okay? And so there you have cocoa, for example. You have fragrance like opium. Floral Oriental, dominated by the orange flower. Think of the great classic of Le Bleu. More recently, you'd have a Marni Code. There you'd have Jean-Paul Gaultier in Allure, for example. Smell them and you pick up that marvelously spicy, honey-sweet note of orange flower. Or the woody Orientals. I was the fellow who invented woody Orientals, not because I was smart or because I was bright. I had to. In 1984, Givenchy introduced Isatis. Ah, said the perfumer, c'est un chypre. No, said Givenchy, it's Oriental. 1985 came Elizabeth Taylor's Passion. Ah, said the perfumer, c'est un chypre. No, said Taylor, Elizabeth Arden, it's an Oriental. They were both right. We were seeing the evolution of a new range of fragrances that took the floral Oriental heart with its flowers and everything, and added the potent wood notes of patchouli and sandalwood to create the fusion on that. And so I started with the woody Orientals, and now everybody has followed into that one there. And the reason I mention these families is because if you ask people, still today, for the names of their 3 or 4 most favorite perfumes, invariably you'll find that at least 2 names fall into the one family. We don't know why. There's so much we don't know about perfume still. We don't know why one person prefers a chypre, another person prefers a floral Oriental. We just know that if you ask people for the names of their favorite fragrances, almost invariably 2 of the names will fall into one of the fragrance families. Please feel free to come in. There's no problem at all. Make yourself comfortable there. And even if you come across somebody, as I suspect most of you, if I asked you for 3 or 4 names, you'd probably trot out 6 or 7, and they'd all belong to different families. And you'd probably look at me in triumph. But all that tells me is that you must love perfume, because there's no way in the world that you could have developed so adventurous, so broad a taste without trying a lot. Ask me, give me more names, and I bet you that one of those families hold an appeal. This is a premise that has been demonstrated in 2 scientific papers published in peer-review magazines. It was subject of a review published in the Perfumery and Flavors based on 400 customers, I think it was, in a Sephora one. It works. It's not the only way to sell perfume, but it certainly is a really helpful way to help figure out which fragrances people should try to start with. Remember, people feel that after 3 fragrances, their nose gets tired. And so you've got to be pretty careful about selecting the right 3 to start with, and that's where the wheel comes in. If you look at my book, you will see that there are 4 columns laid out over fresh, crisp, classic, rich, and permit me, if I may, Mark, just to very briefly explain that one. When I started this book, and the only reason it started is because my first client was a group of perfumeries. This was back in '84. I could help. They wanted me to help develop their fragrance business. I could help them with the training, with the merchandising, with the fragrance selection, but I couldn't be there to sell it. Firmenish's bouquet had long gone, and Firmenich would naturally not allow me to use the updated version they had permitted me to use when I was at Holston. There was one marvelous guide called Harman and Reimer's bouquet, Genealogy, but it had become more and more technical, the tool of evaluators and perfumers, and was difficult for most store people to use there. So willy-nilly, I put together in 1984 a tatty little guide for this store. I mean, it really was small. It was spiral bound. It had 300 fragrances in it, of which about 30 were new. But the layout was interesting because I took this idea of fresh, crisp, classic, rich. Let me just explain what I mean by that. I was looking for a way of explaining perfume that would make sense to people who were not perfumers. My starting point was that in every family we've got a typical or a classical note. Think of Paris, Saint Laurent. It's a typical floral. Think of Chanel 5. It's a typical floral aldehyde. By the way, I don't call mine floral aldehydes. I call them soft florals. Why? Well, if you say to a customer it's a delicious floral aldehyde, they'll invariably pick up and say, what's aldehyde? So you have to say, well, it's a rather nasty smell, but it makes everything else better. And by that time, you've lost the plot. At the end of the day, the aldehydes have all got a softer, powdery kind of note. So for me, it's a soft floral. Remember, my work came from retailers. Likewise, in floral orientals, Armani Code, Oscar would be a classical, typical floral orientals. Opium would be a typical soft oriental. Shalimar, a typical oriental. But how then do you describe the fragrances that are in that family but don't smell quite typical? Let's take an example. Let's take floral. You've got Paris. It's a rose note. But what is the smell of a tuberose? It's also a flower. If you compare that to the smell of Paris, is it a richer scent? You bet. If I turned it into a sound and I gave you Paris and Fracas, Paris is a classical floral, Fracas is a rich tuberose. In the dry down, it would go Paris the classical, Fracas the rich. I'm very bad at singing, but you're going to have to get used to that one there. On the other hand, what flowers smell fresher than rose and tuberose? Gardenia would smell fresher, and the freshest of all would be Lily of the Valley. So if I give you a Lily of the Valley fragrance like Durissimo, and I compare it to a gardenia fragrance, that's a crisp floral, such as Marc Jacobs, compare that to a classical floral, think of Paris, Saint Laurent, compare that to a rich floral, think of the tuberose of Fracas, they all smell flowery, but on the dry down, when you compare them one against the other, it would go Durissimo the fresh, Marc Jacobs the crisp, Paris the classical, Fracas the rich. And that system was there right at the start. That was the key thing. I didn't really realize what I'd actually put together because it's proven to be such an easy way. If it's in the rich column, you know it's going to be a deeper smell. If it's in the fresher column, no, it's not necessarily lighter or less tenacious. It's just going to be a higher kind of scent. Well, it worked. Sales went up. 85, they said, can you update it? 86, 87, 88, Nordstrom, the American department store, found a copy. Don't know how. They said, can you add, please, some more American perfumes? So I did. 91, Nordstrom again said, can you add men's fragrances? Because it was only women's. And so I became the first to match women's and men's. As you know, the oil houses have separate genealogies, one genealogy for men and another for women. It never really made sense to me because smell is smell is smell, but I didn't match men and women simply because I was bright. The reality is that around the world, department stores and perfumeries, 85% of their customers are women. Now, you're probably going to start throwing stones at me when I tell you that most women today still have very little faith in the fragrance judgment of the men in their life. So they tend to buy for men what they like, and we get used to it. And that's why I matched women's and men's. It was as simple as that kind of thing. 93, Nordstrom again, my godfather, my retail godfather. They said, can you please add niche perfumes? Nobody was classifying niche then. Because they wanted to put a Niquetal into South Coast Plaza, a really upscale plaza outside of San Diego. Well, she was ill, so I worked with Isabelle Doyen, her perfumer. Then somebody else said, would you do the same thing for L'Artisan Parfumeur? So what started in 84 as a tiny little guide, by this time it evolved into a big one. And I know the big question you ask is, well, how do the brands accept you? Well, that was the big problem. If they didn't, would I have a problem? Their staff would go into stores, pick up the book, sniff loudly, and walk out, and my whole business would collapse. So obviously I had to check with them, but to be able to do so, I had to be impartial, independent, and so to this day, we make no charge for listing perfume, whether it's big or small, no charge. I don't accept advertising because I think that would compromise the integrity. And I continue to decline consultancies for the brands. I have quite a few retail clients, but I continue to decline consultancies for the brand. As a result, I'm able to work with every brand and every perfumer, probably the only person lucky enough to be able to do so. Life was easy when I did the first book in '84. There were 30 new perfumes. Last year with 1,400, I'd become a nomad. Fortunately, the children are grown up and my wife is comfortable with me traveling around like this. We have a lovely marriage. We've been married for 42 years, and I think it stays fresh because we're apart for about 4 or 5 months each year on that, you see. We live in Paris. We keep an apartment in Paris. It's my soul city, and I use that as the European base for Germany, Barcelona, Italy, of course, and the United Kingdom. I move to the States for about 2 to 3 months a year there to keep track there. And we keep a house in Sydney. My wife is Australian, and we have a cat there. And I love Sydney anyhow, and I keep track then of the Asian market from there. And I see the brands about twice a year. It's really informal. I really work with marketing people. Mainly I'm working with the people who develop the perfume. So at Guerlain, it would primarily be with Sylvain de la Courte, who works with Thierry Vasseur. Givenchy would be François Danche, who handles all the olfactory development. L'Oréal would be Karine Lebray and her team. Estée Lauder would be Karen Curie. As you know, I come around here and you'll see me speaking to Bertrand Dufourcheur. They give me the brands, all the new fragrances, in confidence for probably a year to sometimes. Joe Malone, for example, briefed me the second half of 2015, 2 weeks ago. It's in total confidence. We live our life in total confidence, and we've never broken that confidence. And with their permission, I can then go and check the classifications with the perfumers. So I do all the brands. I did the brands in January, February. Now, the last 3 weeks I've been going around checking in Paris with Firmenich, Givaudan, Takasaka. I go to Munich next week to meet with Drum. It is a lovely life, and I count myself unbelievably lucky to be able to have this. But the result is a book which has become very, very interesting in this idea. And I think by that I probably covered everything, Mark, on that kind of one, how it all started by accident in many ways.
Well, so actually, I want you to cover one more thing. You touched on it just a tiny bit, but I think it's an interesting part of this. As the guide developed, you mentioned you didn't have everybody on board. There had to be a key moment, a key opinion maker who helped you, sort of get the idea that this guide was going to be useful to everybody. Did that happen?
Funny enough, it happened in '85 when I was in Paris, and Jeffrey Webster, he was at that time, it was before he became president of Roy Bertrand, that is now Givenchy. He was marketing director, I think, of Roy Bertrand. That's the great oil house. Think of Opium, Obsession, all of those. And Jeffrey invited me to do a workshop for all his salespeople around the world. I didn't realize the compliment he paid me. I thought, well, okay, I'll happily do this one. But they seemed intrigued. And John Bailey, the president of the British Society of Perfumers, still talks with fond memory about that one. So I guess that was the one. Nordstrom, I think, more than anybody, Mitzi, the VP merchandising there, she was a believer. She just felt it made so much sense. And you really only need one person like that to encourage you.
Right. That was the crux of the question. So one of the things, and you've already spoken about this a little bit, but I'd like you to speak a little bit more about it. I think the fragrance wheel has become an invaluable tool, not only for retail, but it's become an invaluable tool for those of us who write about fragrance.
Sure.
I think for those of us who believe with the idea of perfume as art, we do need to develop a consistent vocabulary, and I think what the fragrance wheel helps us who write about it is there's a consistent vocabulary. So I'd like to talk with you about the development, have you talk a little bit about how you developed these terms. You did already a little bit.
Sure.
And then also how you use this in retail. I know you've talked about the idea that if you like one thing, sometimes if somebody wants something different, you go to the other side of the wheel.
Sure. Pleasure. It evolved really out of a need to explain perfume. I mentioned to you that I was training. I came from marketing, but I became a trainer. Once the retailers picked up my work, I needed to train their staff. And so over the years, I developed a masterclass, a fragrance workshop. I think we were trying to count up the other day. My staff estimate that I've trained now over 60,000 people around the world in the last 30 years. When I do a workshop, it's actually totally hands-on, and it's a fascinating experience. I make no difference between product managers, marketing directors, perfumers, sales staff, customers. For me, perfume is perfume. Let's discover it. And so think of my work as being like wine tasting for your nose. We would do a basic wheel. I would show you a floral, Chloe. I'd compare it to an oriental, Shalimar. Why? Because it's easy for people to get the difference between the two big groups there. I'd compare it to a woody note and then a fresh note. Now, if you look at the standard perfumers classifications, they too have florals, orientals, and woody. I followed them. I was classically trained in that. I added fresh. Why? Because when I started this, the perfumers were ignoring eau de colognes. For them, they were not real perfume. For me, with the creation in 1966 of Roudnitska's Eau Sauvage, he had transformed light, volatile notes into a tenacious perfume. So that's why I added the fresh notes. Secondly, the perfumers put the green notes as a subgroup of the florals. Well, that makes sense. If you've got a pleasantly green fragrance, think, for example, of pleasures. But when you get a real aggressive green note, think of eau de campagne, think of alliage, for example. It smells so grassy, so green, that people who like florals say, yuck. And that was why I separated the green notes into that. So that was the explanation as to why the fresh notes started. Logically, when the water notes came along, we put it there. And as Bath & Body Works developed the fruity notes, that went there. Originally, the fruity notes were right next to the citrus. I thought logically citrus and flesh, but I changed them at the recommendation of two scientists, Dr. Zarkov and Dr. Stanton, who did a study for one of the scientific magazines on my work, comparing it to descriptors. And it was they who said, logically, you ought to put the fruity notes next to the florals. I looked at their argument, looked at the result, looked at the research, and it made sense. So that's there. The names came about, as I've explained. Floral is floral, soft floral. We can't talk about aldehydes. It's a nasty sounding word, and we get trapped into doing explanations on that. Floral orientals, remember that my floral orientals, yours might be one family. I divide them into floral orientals, woody orientals. They both got flowers, but floral orientals got that spicy orange flower note. The woody orientals have got the potent notes of patchouli and sandalwood. Soft oriental. I do add the woody, of course, and the chypre. So basically, that's, I think, how it all developed. It was a way of explaining fragrance. I never really understood. When I started this wheel, it was in fact a fan. And then one day I joined it and never looked back. It's become a symbol. I put Fragrance+Wheel last night into Google, which came out google.it. Guess how many links there were?
How many links? 1,500.
Would you believe over 9 million? No, I'm not kidding. If you do it in England, we got 4 million. If you do it in the States, at one time there were 15 million attached to it. It's kind of become an easy way of explaining for fragrance, I think. The perfumers are very comfortable with it. Givaudan has already said the biggest problem that the industry faces is that everybody's talking different language about perfume. The oil houses are part of the problem. I mean, Givaudan's got a different way of describing fragrance from Firmenich and Drom. It's sort of corporate. We feel we have to have our own one. But that doesn't help. And unfortunately, most of the retailers get thoroughly mixed up. I feel sorry for them. Neiman Marcus, and forgive me if I quote the name specifically, but they have knocked off my work. They decided that they liked the idea of floral and oriental and woody and fresh. They kind of added things like floral, fruity, and oriental, spicy, and woody, musky. Where that comes in, I'm not sure, and fresh citrus. But then they proceeded to mess up the classification. So if you go onto Neiman Marcus and you look at oriental, you will see that, in fact, You know Violet Blonde by Tom Ford? No, it's an Oriental according to Neiman Marcus. Have you smelt Robert Piguet's Bandit? You know, that's a brutal, dry leather note. No. Neiman Marcus says it's Oriental. And when you ask retailers, I could give you a dozen other retailers, when you ask them, why do you say this? The answer invariably is, we got the information from the brands, which is true. But the problem is that some of the brands won't classify. Hermès refuses to classify. Jean-Claude Lerner said to a journalist, ask Michael. Others take the description from the oil houses. But what Givaudan classifies is quite a different way from what Symrise classifies, so you get a mixture there. And sometimes they go to an extreme. I came across a Lulu not too long ago, Mark. Where would you put, I'm trying to remember, green, woody, animalic, floral, ambery leather? It's a stew. Where would you put? So what would you do? But so often the brands use descriptions. Serge Lutens, for example, described Féminité de Bois not as a woody note. No, it's pure sensual. Others describe, Beyoncé describes one of her fragrances as sensual elixir. Well, I know to her it's sensual elixir, but that doesn't help classification. So the retailers get all the stuff from the brands, and they put it all together and they give it to some poor little git who's got the job of trying to make sense out of it. If you don't have the expertise to know what's happening here, then no wonder we get all this kind of a problem. So we do need a common language. At least I can say I've given you the tools of starting a common language. If any of you want to pick it up with pleasure, if any of you want to use this wheel, please feel free. There is no charge. We just ask that you give me credit, copyright credit on it, and put Michael Edwards at that kind of a... Does that cover enough of that?
That covers exactly what I wanted, Michael. Thank you. So my first exposure to you did not come from this book because I wasn't a retailer. I was just a perfume aficionado. And my first exposure came from a book that Michael wrote a few years ago and that I'm pleased that is coming back now. And it's called Perfume Legends.
Oh, okay.
That's the book. That's the one. This is where I learned that there was this wonderful authority by the name of Michael Edwards, and this was the touchstone historical book for me to learn about the styles of perfume, where they came from, and why there were legends in perfume. And so Michael, I'd like you, and it's been out of print for a while, and this is one of those things where I can't easily tell somebody. I know the last time I saw a copy on eBay, my eyes bugged out of my head when I went for way too much money. And so he told me as we were preparing for this that he's preparing to bring it back. And so I think this is a great opportunity for people in this room who are unaware of this book, and I want him to speak about it because it is absolutely one of the best historical books of perfume I have ever read.
Thank you very much. I wish I could tell you where to get it. It is out of print. Copies have reached unbelievable prices. I checked the Italian Amazon. One is two copies, new copies are going for over 700 euros. Second-hand copies, the cheapest one was 210 euros, I think, yesterday. In the United Kingdom, a copy was sold on Amazon last month for £571. It has become a cult among the young. I can't tell you how flattered and honored I feel. Again, I wish I could tell you I was brilliant, but it happened by chance. I've always been fascinated by the art of perfume, because for me at its best, perfume is art, emotional art. Oh, I know there's a lot of plonk out there, but every now and then you smell something and your nose says, wow. And yet, there was no book in which the perfumers spoke about their work. One company president told me, they're people of the shade. Yeah, almost, like little children. Just stand there but don't talk. We had books by musicians, sculptors, artists, but nothing by perfumers. And so I started talking to them. This was round about late 80s. To my surprise, they were willing to talk. And then I had the fortune to interest two of the great masters. One was Guy Robert. Guy was the master perfumer, Madame Rochas, Calèche, most of the Guccis. At that time, at the height of his career, president of the French Society of Perfumers. one of the nicest men I've ever met in my life. Something intrigued him. He became more and more intrigued by the project. Hardly a week went by that Guy wasn't saying to me before emails, hey, I found this, I'm faxing this to you, go and have a look, go and talk to this person. We became very close. He became my mentor, very close friend, and for the last 16 years, in fact, he was the technical consultant for my guidebook there. Sadly, he died last year. The other great help was Edmond Roudnitska, the great perfumer. As you know, Monsieur Roudnitska became famous in 1944 for his creation of Femme. With the money that made him, because perfumers at that time were paid a commission, he set up a little laboratory outside of Grasse in Cabris. He made only 9 perfumes in his life, but 4 were architectural masterpieces that changed perfumery. Think of Diorissimo, think of Diorella, think of Eau Sauvage. But he was also the only man living, only perfumer living, who had known some of the great early perfumers, Ernest Beau, who created Chanel No. 5, Almaraz, who did all the Patou fragrances, because Roudnitska had started working in 1927. But by the time I wrote to him, he was already a very old man, with a reputation of eating people like me for breakfast, so I thought I'd be lucky if I got maybe, 10 minutes. But he agreed to receive me, and something clicked. He gave me more than 2 hours, almost 3 hours the first time. And it was he and Guy Robert who opened doors for me. Without their help, I doubt that many people would have agreed to see me, let alone talk to me at length. I ended up interviewing just under 160 people, perfumers obviously, everybody that I could find, heads of companies, Maurice Roget, who led the Renaissance of Dior, Vera Stubbe, who was behind Thierry Mugler's Angel, Chantal Rousse, whom you have you been to see her thing? I don't know if you know Chantal Rousse, but she was the maestro who actually engineered the rise of Saint Laurent. She came in during the development of opium. She was behind Paris. She was behind Curas. She's the woman who directed Issey Miyake and Jean-Paul Gaultier, a marvelous kind of person there. I interviewed her on 3 occasions. In fact, we had an old conversation, reminding ourselves of what happened just yesterday. Philippe Guerlain, Robert Ritchie. I spoke to bottle designers, Pierre Dinant, the father of bottle designs. Think of opium. We share a studio today together. Serge Monceau. And I spoke to couturiers, Saint Laurent, Givenchy, Issey Miyake, Jean-Paul Gaultier, Thierry Mugler, and most of them. And all of them I said, if in your mind, what are the key iconic French perfumes? And we agreed 45, starting with Jicky of 1889, because for us Jicky was the first perfume that turned perfume from an imitation, a craft, into an art. Before Jicky, the perfumers were imitating nature, a rose, a jasmine. Jicky was the first experience, absolutely the first niche kind of fragrance that came along there. It was a new experience, and ending up with Angel and L'Eau d'Essai of 92. The book was brilliant, not because I wrote it, but because for the first time, you could actually read the words of the creators. 80% of the text is not my opinion, it's actually the words of the creators. Everybody that I interviewed had the chance to check the accuracy of the draft. And so it's become a reference book for the perfumer's school. As Mark said, it's sadly out of print. I am working now on an updated version, aiming to come out in 2015, early 2016. I plan to add 6 new perfumes to the 45 I wrote about. I'm putting in Fracas. It was not in the original one because Fracas by Piquet had been prostituted. The juice was so cheap at that time. Now they brought it back to the original glory. I'll be putting in Féminité du Bois by Shiseido originally, now Serge Lantin's such an influential woody note. Jean-Paul Gaultier, Flower by Kenzo. Diptyques, Philosikos, and of course Coco Mademoiselle. So that will be available in 18 months. We're also working on, and I'm not going to charge you 700 euros for it, I promise you. We're also working on the American legends. I've done most of the interviews, starting with Bluegrass of 1934, going into White Linen of 1948, Youth Dew, of course, of 53, then the great progression of Estee Lauder fragrances from 68, Estee, the first fragrance that made the American fragrance and made the French perfumers jealous. And, I mean, just think of what Lauder transformed. Can you imagine? Estee, 68, Alliage, 72, Private Collection, 73, White Linen, 78, Aromatics Elixir, 1981, beautiful night. I mean, each one's genius in its originality. The book will be dedicated to Estee Lauder and to Ernest Shifton, the head of IFF, the master of American perfumers there, because it was those two people who transformed perfume into American perfume to be every bit the equal of French perfumery at that time. In the long term, I'm aiming to put my work into a foundation, and I will finance it to allow person that I'm currently talking to conduct other interviews and update it and publish it every 10 years. Osmotec has been honoured me to do this. The Society of Perfumers have been honoured me to do it. There's clearly something in the book that talks to people, and I don't want it to end with me. So I hope that we'll have a long future there.
Thank you, Michael. So I think at this point, I'd like to take some questions from the audience, because I had the pleasure of preparing to have all of these questions I had answered, but I'm hoping some of you have some questions. So I'm opening the floor to questions. Oh, wait a minute.
Thank you for your beautiful presentation, and it was a very learning experience. And I wanted to ask you about what, in your opinion, I'm sure you must have worked with people starting out in the industry, and that what, in your opinion, is like your tip or your advice to people starting out to be successful in this industry?
Would you be kind enough to tell me at what area? Are you looking to be a perfumer, an evaluator, a marketing person, or what?
I think as like as an art industry, or like the fact that people obviously are losing, like Estee Lauder, like someone was telling me, was wishing that he had not gone as big as he did, because he said that they lose out on the art. And it's all about number crunching, and it's no different from a real estate industry.
Interesting question you raised, very interesting. In a world of marketing, the key opportunity you have is to keep your passion alive. I don't know how you can do it. I can't tell you how to keep your passion alive. I can only tell you that when I speak, when I go and see companies, what I look for are people who are passionate about what they're doing. When I work with Estee Lauder, with Karen Curry, she started with Mrs. Lauder on the development of fragrances in 1982, I think it is. Since then, she's worked on the development of every Lauder fragrance. Karen is as bloody passionate today as I think she must have been then. She hasn't lost the passion. Yeah, the number crunchers will get in your way. The marketing people will do silly stuff at times. But this happens in every career. It doesn't really matter what we do, except the reality that 95% of people are there for a job. They're there to try to make more money if they possibly can. They're there, their family, they've got other interests there. And in many cases, they won't understand your passion. I mean, Mark's a scientist. His colleagues, I think him absolutely weird that he has this passion for it on this kind of thing. All I can say to you is that there's only one thing that you have to do. Work at something that, above all, you love. How could I have put together a business if you'd approached me 30 years ago and said, well, come off it. Are you going to make any money putting together that stuff? I'd probably have had to say no. And if a business school had given me a cost study on it, showing me what it would take and would I have gone with it? No. Did I think I could make much money out of it? No, frankly, but I wanted to try. I thought I could make more money advising retailers, actually. But I loved it. And I suppose the passion came across there. So to come back in a long-winded way to your answer, number one, find something that you love doing, regardless of whether you think it can make you money, and do it. That's the only hope you have in the longer term.
Anybody else?
Thank you for your work. I think you did to perfumery what Dewey did with books. You invented a kind of classification using words while Dewey used it with numbers. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
But my question is, can you forecast in the next 20 years the turning out of a new family based on your knowledge?
Interesting one. The Water Notes came out when we saw New West come out from Estee Lauder in 1990. It didn't work. It used cologne and overdose, which had been used in detergents. That's the smell of your laundry. But Corin put a 5% overdose in it, and to many people it smelt of seaweed and stuff like that. And we all thought, it's never going to work. And then, of course, in 91 came Escape. And that was the first one. Escape's still not quite right. The top note's too sharp. But what about sunflowers? What about l'eau d'essai? So clearly, that's how a family evolved. Is there likely to be one? I sense that we could be heading towards a gourmand family. At the moment, for me, I use gourmand as an accent in every family. So Prada candy would be oriental with no gourmand note, for example. But there is a possibility that we might well get the fusion of such gourmand characters, and we say, okay, Angel is really the first one in that particular one for the future. But we don't want to complicate things too much. The only reason to add a new family is if it gives us a way of helping customers. Otherwise, it just confuses the issue. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question regarding reformulations. The brands say that this is what the market wants, this is what the customers want, this is what the focus groups tell them, that it's necessary to reformulate. And when I talk to people doing my workshops, they always ask me, why are fragrances being reformulated? We hate them. That our memories are lost, that what we remember, smells connected with people, places, emotions, that they are gone. We are no longer able to find the fragrances we fell in love with. So why does it happen?
Isn't it tragic? I guess it came about in the 1980s. Do you remember Femme, for example? Laurent Normand, who'd come from Chanel, and he should have known better. He decided that Madame Rochas and Femme needed updating. He believed they have to be more contemporary, was his word. And so Olivia Cresp did a very fine job in changing that. But when I compare what I smell now to the original Madame Rochas, but Francois Robert Guy's son occasionally makes up the original one for me. Oh, yeah. So then we saw Von Vert. Remember the original? I mean, it was a brutal green. And then they kind of softened it a little bit, and nothing took off. So I guess that was the first time we started to see the brands saying, look, perfume must be kept contemporary. It always has been, take Chanel for example, number 5, part of the perfumer's job, whether it was Beau or Henri Robert or Jacques Polge, for example, or now his son who will take over. Their job is to keep Chanel number 5 contemporary. I mean, for a start, flowers change year by year. So you have to accept in perfume there's going to be some change. You know, sometimes I think people who talk about this, they forget that a wine cannot be standardized the same each year. And it's an important note to be done. But secondly, Chanel have always believed that the formula, little by little by little, needs to be changed each year, just to bring it up to date. And they've been a genius on it. But then came IFRA and studies. Now, if you really want a background on this, it's not me. He's the man. Because Mark has this marvelous scientific background, and Mark and I were talking about it sometime, and I said, Mark, look, I'm not a chemist. I just don't understand why. I'm not seeing any scientific studies that indicate why these issues are actually the degree that they're sensitizing. Well, Mark explained to me that much of this has come out of the greenies from the Scandinavian area, that most of the evidence is anecdotal, and he sent me a huge wad of papers like this, in which he pointed out there were only 2 studies that would have passed scientific scrutiny. You know, in any scientific study, you need to have both a placebo and the real thing, a double-blind thing. There were none of those. What we've got is a mass of anecdotal evidence. Question, why aren't the houses yelling? I don't know, I can't answer that. We're losing our whole heritage. Why aren't they screaming and yelling? Is it because you can make more money out of new molecules than you can out of naturals? I don't know. At the same time, in fairness to the brands, we live in a litigious age where people will take legal action. And I would say that deep down, LVMH have said, look, we just don't want to get tied up in hundreds of thousands of tiny legal cases. Far rather, let's cut it. Let's ensure that the ingredients we use are not subject to continual legal action. I suspect that's there. But the other side of the coin is that many of the great fragrances that are so obviously changed have been changed because they're lazy. Take Master Cartier. Genius. Created by Jacques Dinan in 1981. Genius of a fragrance there. It's Shalimar with green notes in it, with a alliage dress on top. It is. But Cartier introduced new fragrances. Musk became not the most important. Regulations came in. The perfumers, Givaudan, changed it. But Musk wasn't watching. Cartier wasn't watching. And a junior perfumer was put on the reformulation. He used a horrible synthetic musk. It took Mathilde Laurent, who'd come from Guerlain, to go to say, when she smelled it, she said, "This is horrible." And she worked with Givaudan to bring it back to its original glory. Smell Mitsuku. Go and smell the new one. Telly Vassar has done an amazing job on being able to come up with a new, I don't know if it's one or a couple, oak moss molecules. As you know, oak moss is severely restricted now. He's done a beautiful job on his Mitsuku. So I don't believe that we have to automatically accept that these old perfumes are lost forever. It was Luca Turin in a quotation at a lecture yesterday, I think, who said, perfumers are very inventive in getting a way around it. All we got to do is to make sure that the houses believe that it's important for them to do it. And sadly, many of these are small fragrances. For those of you who are looking to go back, have you been to see Le Galion? I was so taken with that. The reconstruction of that house with Thomas Fontaine and others, so good. You can get back to some of the character of the original ones. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
So I think that is the perfect place to stop today. And I want to thank Michael Edwards for the time he took to do this. I want to thank you for your attention. Please join me in thanking Michael not only for this, but for the 30 years of service he has given to this industry with this invaluable guide.
Thank you, Noel. Guys, whoa. I must thank you, because you have made it possible. Thank you very much indeed. And Saskia, thank you so much for the beautiful floral decorations you've created. I really mean it, guys. You've been willing to see me. You've been willing to be patient with me, get me all the information. I could not have existed without you. So in turn, I must thank you.